Robert had been awake since 4 in the morning. At 70 years old, sleep didn't come as easily as it used to, especially when his mind was heavy with worry. Today was different from all the other days he'd lived through since coming back from Vietnam over 50 years ago. Today he had to walk into a courtroom and fight for his grandson's future. He stood in front of his bedroom mirror, carefully putting on his military dress uniform. The dark blue fabric still fit him well, though his shoulders weren't quite as broad as they once were. His fingers moved slowly over each ribbon and medal, memories flooding back with every piece of metal and cloth he pinned to his chest. The bronze star reminded him of the night he carried wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. The Vietnam Service Medal brought back images of humid jungles and the faces of friends who never made it home. But it was the Purple Heart that made him pause the longest. The small heart-shaped medal with George Washington's profile seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in his weathered hands. He could still feel the hot shrapnel that had torn through his leg and side during that terrible morning in 1968. He remembered the explosion, the screams, the smell of smoke and blood. Most of all, he remembered dragging 3 of his fellow soldiers to safety before collapsing himself. His grandson Tommy was in trouble, and that's why Robert was getting dressed up like this. The boy had seen an older homeless veteran being attacked by 3 young men outside a convenience store. Without thinking twice, Tommy had stepped in to help. The fight that followed left one of the attackers with a broken nose, and the other, 2 running away. But now Tommy was facing assault charges and the whole thing seemed so unfair. Robert had raised Tommy since the boy was 12. That was when Robert's own son, Tommy's father, had been killed by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan. Another war, another generation, another family torn apart, but Robert had done his best to raise the boy right, to teach him about honor and doing what's right even when it's hard. Walking to his car, Robert felt the weight of every medal on his chest. These weren't just pieces of metal to him. They represented every friend he'd lost, every night he'd spent in the jungle listening for enemy movements, every time he'd risked his life for his country. They represented the values he'd tried to pass on to Tommy: courage, loyalty, and standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The courthouse was a big, intimidating building with tall columns and marble steps. As Robert climbed those steps, he thought about all the times he'd walked into dangerous situations during the war. This felt just as scary, but in a different way. He wasn't afraid of getting hurt. He was afraid of letting Tommy down. Inside the courthouse, people stared at his uniform and medals. Some nodded respectfully, recognizing a veteran when they saw one. Others just looked curious. Robert straightened his shoulders and walked with the same pride he'd carried as a young soldier. He had every right to be here, every right to speak up for his grandson, and every right to wear the medals he'd earned with his blood and sacrifice. The courtroom was already filling up with people. Robert could see Tommy sitting at a table with his lawyer, looking young and scared. Their eyes met across the room and Robert gave him a small nod. Everything was going to be okay. He was here now, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to the boy who meant everything to him. Judge Williams had been on the bench for 15 years, and he ran his courtroom like a tight ship. Everything had to be perfect, orderly, and by the book. He didn't tolerate any nonsense, and everyone who entered his courtroom knew they had to follow his rules. When he walked in that morning, his black robes flowing behind him, everyone stood up as they always did. The case seemed simple enough to him. A young man had gotten into a fight and hurt someone. There would be testimony, evidence, and then he would make his decision. He had handled hundreds of cases just like this one. But as he settled into his chair and looked out over the courtroom, something caught his eye immediately. There, sitting in the 3rd row, was an old man in a military uniform covered with ribbons and medals. The Purple Heart on his chest gleamed under the courtroom lights. Judge Williams frowned. He had rules about proper courtroom attire, and military decorations weren't part of his usual courtroom decorum. The lawyer for Tommy began by calling Robert to the witness stand. Robert stood up slowly, his back straight despite his age, and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet room. People turned to watch him, some whispering to each other about his impressive display of military honors. But before Robert could even reach the witness chair, Judge Williams held up his hand to stop him. The room went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing and looked up to see what was happening. "Sir," Judge Williams said in his stern, authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you to remove those decorations before you take the stand. This is a court of law, not a military ceremony." Robert stopped walking. He looked up at the judge with confusion in his eyes. Around the courtroom, people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Tommy's face went pale as he watched his grandfather standing there, not knowing what to do. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't understand," Robert said quietly. Judge Williams pointed directly at the Purple Heart on Robert's chest. "Those medals, sir, they need to come off. I maintain proper decorum in my courtroom, and military decorations are not appropriate attire for civilian court proceedings." The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. An older woman in the back row gasped softly. Several men who looked like they might be veterans themselves sat forward in their chairs, their faces showing shock and anger. Robert's hands moved unconsciously to his chest, covering his medals as if to protect them. His mind raced back to the day he'd received the Purple Heart. He remembered lying in that hospital bed in Vietnam, barely alive, when the commanding officer had pinned it to his hospital gown. He remembered thinking about his buddies who hadn't made it to any hospital, who had died in his arms in that jungle. "Your Honor," Robert's lawyer said, standing up quickly, "my client is here as a character witness. He's wearing his dress uniform out of respect for the court." But Judge Williams wasn't backing down. "I don't care what his intentions are. I have rules in this courtroom, and everyone follows them, no exceptions." He looked directly at Robert, again. "Sir, you will remove those decorations now, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Tommy started to stand up, his face red with anger, but his lawyer quickly pulled him back down. The tension in the room was growing by the second. People were whispering louder now, and some were shaking their heads in disbelief. Robert stood, there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. His whole life seemed to flash before his eyes. He thought about his fallen comrades, about his son who had died in Afghanistan, about Tommy who was counting on him. These medals weren't just decorations to him. They were symbols of everything he held sacred. The judge was waiting for an answer, and the whole courtroom was watching to see what this old soldier would do. Robert's hands shook slightly as he looked down at his Purple Heart. The courtroom was so quiet that everyone could hear the old air conditioning unit humming in the corner. Time seemed to stop as everyone waited to see what he would do. Would he follow the judge's order and remove his medals? Or would he stand up for what he believed was right? For a moment, Robert's fingers moved toward the clasp of his Purple Heart. Tommy watched from his seat, his heart breaking as he saw his grandfather's internal struggle. The old man had sacrificed so much already. Tommy didn't want him to get in trouble because of this court case. But then Robert stopped. His hand froze over the medal, and something changed in his eyes. The confusion and hurt were replaced by something stronger: determination. He had faced enemy fire, watched friends die, and carried wounded soldiers to safety. He had earned these medals with his blood, sweat, and tears. More importantly, he had earned them by living up to the values they represented. Robert slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Judge Williams. When he spoke, his voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger with each word. "Your Honor," he said, "I mean no disrespect to this court or to you personally. I've spent my whole life respecting authority and following orders. I served my country for 2 tours in Vietnam, and I raised my grandson to respect the law and do what's right." The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Then you'll follow my order and remove those decorations." But Robert shook his head, slowly. "I can't do that, sir. This medal," he touched the Purple Heart gently, "represents something bigger than both of us. It represents the day I nearly died trying to save 3 of my fellow soldiers. It represents every man and woman who never made it home from that war." His voice grew emotional, but he continued speaking. "I lost my best friend Billy Johnson when he threw himself on a grenade to save the rest of us. I held Tommy Rodriguez in my arms as he died from a sniper's bullet, and he asked me to tell his mother he loved her. I watched David Kim bleed out in a rice field because we couldn't get a helicopter to him in time. The courtroom was completely silent now. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Even Judge Williams had stopped interrupting. "This medal isn't just a piece of metal," Robert continued, his voice now strong and clear. "It's a promise I made to every soldier who didn't come home. A promise that their sacrifice would be remembered, that their values would live on. I've worn it to my son's wedding, to my grandson's graduation, and to my own son's funeral when he was killed in Afghanistan." Robert's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away from the judge. "I'm here today because my grandson learned those same values. He saw an old veteran being beaten by 3 young men and he didn't walk away. He stepped in to help, just like I taught him to do, just like those soldiers who died in Vietnam taught me to do." The old man's voice cracked with emotion. "If wearing this medal in your courtroom, while I stand up for a young man who was standing up for what's right, is contempt of court, then I guess I'm in contempt. But I won't dishonor the memory of my fallen brothers by taking it off. Not today. Not ever." Robert stood there, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his hand still protectively covering his purple heart. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air like morning fog. Judge Williams stared at Robert for a long moment, his face unreadable. The power in the courtroom seemed to have shifted somehow. This wasn't just about courtroom rules anymore. This was about something much deeper, much more important than any legal proceeding. The silence that followed Robert's words was unlike anything anyone in that courtroom had ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that comes when something profound has just happened, when everyone knows they've witnessed something special that will stay with them forever. Then somewhere in the back of the courtroom someone started clapping. It was slow, deliberate clapping, the kind that comes from deep respect rather than mere approval. Everyone turned to see who it was. An elderly man with gray hair and calloused hands was standing up, his eyes fixed on Robert. The man was wearing a simple button that read "Vietnam Veteran," and his weathered face showed the same kind of strength and dignity that Robert had just displayed. The clapping spread like ripples in a pond. First, the woman sitting next to the veteran stood up and began clapping. Then the man in front of her. Within seconds, more people were rising from their seats, their applause growing louder and more passionate with each passing moment. A middle-aged woman who had been crying quietly was now standing and clapping with tears streaming down her face. Next to her, a young man in work clothes who looked like he might be Tommy's age was also on his feet. Behind them, an older couple held hands. As they stood and applauded, both of them looking at Robert with obvious admiration. But it wasn't just the older people in the courtroom. Young people were standing too. College students, mothers with children, working people who had taken time off to attend court. They were all on their feet, showing their respect for this old soldier who had refused to back down from what he believed was right. Even some of the court staff were affected by the moment. The bailiff, a former Marine himself, was standing at attention near his post, his face showing the deep respect one veteran has for another. The court reporter had stopped typing and was wiping tears from her eyes as she watched the incredible scene unfolding before her. Judge Williams found himself in a position he had never been in before. His own courtroom was in complete chaos, with nearly everyone standing and applauding, but it wasn't disrespectful chaos. It was something else entirely. It was a spontaneous outpouring of respect and emotion that he had never seen in his 15 years on the bench. "Order! Order in the court!" he called out, banging his gavel repeatedly. But the applause continued. People weren't being defiant. They were being human. They had just witnessed something that touched their hearts in a way that courtroom rules and procedures never could. Tommy was crying now, overwhelmed by the support being shown for his grandfather. His lawyer was standing too, applauding along with everyone else. Even the prosecutor, a man known for his tough stance on crime, had risen from his seat and was clapping respectfully. The applause went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. As it finally began to die down, people slowly returned to their seats, but the energy in the room had completely changed. This wasn't the same formal, intimidating courtroom it had been just minutes before. Now it felt like a place where real, human emotions and values mattered more than rigid rules. Robert stood through it all, still protecting his Purple Heart with his hand, tears continuing to flow down his cheeks. He hadn't expected this reaction. He had simply spoken from his heart about something that mattered deeply to him. But somehow his words had touched something in everyone else's hearts too. As the room finally quieted down, all eyes turned back to Judge Williams. The man who had seemed so powerful and authoritative just minutes before now looked smaller somehow, more human. He was faced with a choice that would define not just this case, but his entire career as a judge. The old soldier stood there waiting, dignity intact despite his tears, ready to face whatever consequences might come from his decision to stand up for his beliefs and the memory of his fallen comrades. Judge Williams sat behind his bench, his black robe suddenly feeling heavier than they ever had before. He removed his reading glasses slowly and set them down on the desk in front of him. For the first time in his 15-year career, he wasn't sure what to say. The courtroom was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, expectant, hopeful, and somehow warmer. He looked out at Robert, who was still standing near the witness chair, his hand still protectively covering his Purple Heart. The old man's face showed a mixture of defiance and vulnerability that the judge had never seen before in his courtroom. This wasn't a criminal trying to get away with something or a lawyer trying to win a case. This was a man standing up for something he believed in with every fiber of his being. Judge Williams had grown up hearing stories about World War II and Vietnam from his own father, who had served in Korea. He remembered his father telling him about the importance of honor, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right. Somehow, over the years of dealing with criminals and legal technicalities, he had forgotten those lessons. But sitting here now, looking at this elderly veteran, those memories came flooding back. The judge stood up slowly from his chair. The entire courtroom held its breath as they waited to see what he would do. Would he follow through on his threat to hold Robert in contempt? Would he stick to his strict rules about courtroom decorum? "Mr. Robert," Judge Williams said, his voice much softer than it had been before, "I owe you an apology, not just as a judge, but as an American citizen who has benefited from the sacrifices you and countless others have made." A collective sigh seemed to go through the courtroom. People who had been holding their breath finally relaxed a little, sensing that something good was about to happen. "You're absolutely right," the judge continued. "That medal and all the others you wear represent something far more important than my courtroom rules. They represent the best of what America stands for: courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." Judge Williams looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with many of the people who had stood and applauded just minutes before. "I've been so focused on maintaining order and following procedures that I lost sight of why we have courts. In the first place, we're here to seek justice, and justice isn't just about following rules, it's about doing what's right." He turned his attention to Tommy, who was watching with wide eyes and a face full of hope. "Young man, after hearing what your grandfather just told us about the values he taught you, and after reading the police report about what happened that night, I have a much clearer picture of who you are and why you acted as you did." The judge picked up the case file and looked through it again. "The report states that you saw 3 men attacking a homeless veteran who was asking for spare change outside a convenience store. Instead of walking away or calling for help, you stepped in to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. One of the attackers ended up with a broken nose, but only after you were struck first and only after you asked them multiple times to stop hurting the old man." Tommy nodded, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "Your grandfather has shown me today what real courage looks like," Judge Williams continued. "It's not about being the strongest or the toughest person in the room. It's about standing up for your principles even when it's hard, even when there might be consequences. You showed that same courage when you stepped in to help that veteran." The judge set the file down and made his decision. "I'm reducing the charges against you to community service. 200 hours working with veterans organizations in this community. I think that's fitting given the circumstances." The courtroom erupted in quiet cheers and applause. Tommy's face broke into a smile as his lawyer patted him on the back, but the judge wasn't finished yet. "Mr. Robert," Judge Williams said, "would you please take the witness stand now? I'd like to hear what you have to say about your grandson." Robert walked slowly to the witness chair, his medals catching the light as he moved. As he sat down, he looked out at the faces in the courtroom, faces that were now smiling at him with respect and admiration. "Your Honor," Robert said, his voice strong and clear now, "my grandson is a good young man who learned early in life that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Just like those soldiers I served with in Vietnam, Tommy didn't think about his own safety when he saw someone in trouble. He just acted on the values we tried to teach him." As Robert left the courthouse that day, his grandson walking beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt proud, not just of his military service, but of the man his grandson had become and of his own decision to stand up for what he believed in, even in the face of authority. The purple, heart on his chest seemed to shine a little brighter in the afternoon sunlight.